You've probably all heard many reports of where the U.S. rates in terms of science and technology teaching, and in terms of other countries around the world. It's usually not a very enthusiastic or positive spin on it. But today we're going to hear on the whole issue of U.S. science education and global competitiveness. The talk will be given by Dr. Bruce Fuchs, who's the director at the NIH Office of Science Education. He's responsible for monitoring a range of science education policy issues for the leadership of NIH. And he's going to talk about the whole issue of science and global competitiveness. Dr. Fuchs.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you today. This is actually my my second time addressing the National Capital Area Skeptics. So although I think the first time was probably 12 or 13 or 14 years ago. So there's lots of new stuff to talk about. I believe that most of you would probably know that if we were asked to sort of rank the United States in terms of the effectiveness of our science and math and technology and engineering education, that we wouldn't rank at the top of the world. But unless you've paid sort of close attention to where we are, you may be surprised at just how dismally we have been performing. So what we're going to do over the next 45 or 50 minutes is go through some of the data from the leading exams, the international comparison exams. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail, and we'll try and put things in in perspective. I don't want to send you home with the feeling that the sky is falling, but I don't want to send you home with the feeling that you should don't worry, be happy either. We've got a challenge ahead of us. It's not unlike other challenges that we've faced before, and so I think we're up to the task. The main question is really, is the USA losing its competitive edge, and what's the evidence that the USA might be losing its competitive edge? I suspect that a number of you have either read or you've heard of Tom Friedman's bestseller. It was on the bestseller list forever. The World is Flat. And what Tom Friedman said in that book, if you haven't read it, is really that there has been a convergence of events and technologies that has allowed competition to become global in a way that it never has before. Now, for a long time, we've had increasing globalization. If you think about it, railroads, steamships, everything have contributed to globalization for hundreds of years. But this is a different kind of globalization. That kind of globalization always required emigration or moving. So you would move goods or you would move people from one country to another. What we have now is a type of globalization where an education surplus in one part of the world can satisfy an education deficit in another part of the world without immigration. So we've seen for 20, 30, 40 years that well-educated scientists and physicians from around the world have come to the United States to work. Probably the best example is India. India, sometime after World War II, created a group of IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology. They give their students truly a world-class education in math and engineering and science. The problem has been that the Indian economy was not prepared to give those people jobs commensurate with their skills. So they've gone to Australia, they've gone to Europe, they've come to the United States to find those jobs. So what Friedman says in the end, we've got to move up the value chain, and education is key to this. So I want to step back a bit and ask a historical question. How did the United States gain its position of dominance in the world in terms of economy? So let's look at that history. If we had looked at bookstores in London about 100 years ago, we could have found this book. It's not really The World is Flatter. It's really called The American Invaders. It was published in 1901. And Frederick Mackenzie was the author. He was a journalist who had been touring around the USA, writing alarmed dispatches back to newspapers in the United Kingdom, worried about what he saw. And he says, England has slept while commercial rivals went ahead. She has been too content to rest satisfied with the great accomplishment of past generations. In short, Britons have been a little too prosperous, far too easygoing. Master and men alike have been too readily contented. But those who know anything of the great reserve of strength of England are best aware that the nation needs only to rouse herself in earnest to recover much of the lost ground. It's not a message unlike Tom Friedman's in The World is Flat. What does Frederick attribute this to? He says that Americans are succeeding today largely because of their climate, their better education, their longer working hours, their willingness to receive new ideas, and perhaps most of all, their freedom from hampering traditions. The American workman is, on the whole, much better educated than his English rival. So that's a surprising thing for somebody to say that we're the best educated in the world. We haven't heard that for a little while. So let's explore the evidence for that and when it might have happened. Now, most of these ideas are coming out of a wonderful book that was published a couple years ago by Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz. They're both they're both economists at Harvard. Claudia Golden is an economic historian. Lawrence Katz is a labor economist. And they wrote this book looking at the history of education in the United States. So if we go back to about the 1830s, you can see in this graph that I've made that compares the gross domestic product of the United States and the United Kingdom, just what a giant the United Kingdom was. That tiny little island had a GDP 4 to 5-fold larger than that of the entire United States. But we had something that started in the 1830s that Golden and Katz call the common school movement. Now, common schools are what we would today call elementary schools. And this was not a federal initiative. This was not a centralized plan. This was communities all over the young nation deciding to band together, create common schools, and begin to educate their children. And at least in part, this was a response to what their children would have been denied in the old country. Because at that time in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, education was largely reserved for the aristocracy and the children, almost exclusively the male children of the very rich. So this common school movement was a sort of democratic response to this. Communities would go together, build a building, hire a teacher, and send all of their children there. Now, from the very beginning, it was at least partially subsidized by the community. It wasn't totally free. Sometime it was, you would pay for half the tuition or a quarter of the tuition or 2/3. It differed by community. By 1850, between 1850 and 1860, Katz and Golden estimate that we had the best educated workforce in the world. At that time, it meant they could read, they could do a little bit of arithmetic, and this was as the Industrial Revolution was getting going in the United States. So these laborers were perfectly positioned to go into factories, follow instructions, prepare simple reports for the management, and benefit from this kind of education and the industrialization. So by the end of that century, the United States had surpassed the United Kingdom in terms of its GDP, and we had continued to make, after creating common schools, a series of wise educational policy decisions. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln passed the Morrill Act in the middle of the Civil War. He believed so strongly that, that states needed universities, higher education, that this was also known as the Land Grant Colleges Act. Later on, in 1890, there was a second Morrill Act providing funding for higher education in states that had not participated in the first round. And if you look at the 20th century, you'll see just how wealthy the United States became. This is why economists often call the 20th century the American century. No nation had ever become so rich so fast, at least until China, as did the United States. So during this time, we continued to make a series of wise or fortuitous, however you want to look at it, education decisions. As the rest of the world was beginning to catch up and catch on that our workers were better educated and began to put their children into elementary education, we started the high school movement, which is generally believed to have run from about 1910 to 1940. So before 1910, you were actually a rarer commodity if you had a high school diploma in the United States than you are today if you have a Ph.D. or an M.D. or a J.D., something like that. So very, very few, probably 5% of Americans had a high school diploma at the turn of the century. By 1940, when we went into World War II, the average soldier was a high school graduate or a high school student. No other army in the world could claim that. And the generals at the time ascribed much of our success to that. Our soldiers were better read, could follow more complex decisions, could adapt when the first plan didn't work out. And after the war, then, we had the GI Bill, which allowed many of those soldiers to go on to college. Post-Sputnik, there was the National Defense Education Act. So in summary, what Golden and Katz have said is that our commitment to education in the United States was the largest measurable input to the growth of our economy. It was larger than financial capital, physical capital, natural resources. We were, in most of these cases, 50 to 60 years ahead of most of the rest of the world in terms of educating our students. So how do we compare today? The international exam that I'm going to talk the most about is called Pisa, the Program for International Student Assessment. It's sponsored by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It is specifically designed to meet the policy needs of governments. These are governments looking at their own education system, benchmarking their education system to that of other nations around the world so that they can make wise investments to benefit their own citizens. Pisa is a little bit different from the other major international exam, which is known as TIMSS, Trends in International Math and Science Study. TIMSS looks at something that we call curricular competency. So TIMSS tries to measure what kids have learned in school. So the eighth grade math TIMSS exam looks a lot like an 8th grade math quiz would. That's not true of Pisa. Pisa is trying to look at literacy. That is the capacity of 15-year-olds, because they always assess 15-year-old students, no matter what grade they're in, to apply knowledge that they have gained in school and out of school to real-life situations that they might encounter on the job or at home. in the last Pisa exam, the Pisa 2009, there were about 60 countries that participated. About 30 of them are OECD members. So you can think of OECD as a club of the nation's rich, a club of the world's rich nations or developed nations. And then the other 30 or so are developing nations which have bought their way into the exam because they've decided it's very important to benchmark themselves against the best in the world. So here's the results of the 2006 Pisa science study. Every 3 years, Pisa is given to the participating nations, and one of the 3 main topics is in the foreground. So they'll do reading, and then science, and then math. So the 2009 Pisa focused on reading. The 2006 Pisa focused on science. So you can see that overall, the United States is not ranked near the top of the world. We're going to look at this kind of a plot in more detail in a minute. We're going to take it apart. I'll explain to you how to analyze it. So at this point, I just want you to understand that we're not really near the top of the world. If you look at the countries in black, those are the OECD members. The countries in blue are the non-OECD members that have bought their way into this exam. So you can see that we rank pretty much at the bottom of the OECD members. We're at the bottom of the world's rich or developed nations. Another great thing about Pisa is they do a lot of analysis of the school systems, the resources that schools have, the training that teachers go through. And so one question that often comes up is, are we spending enough on our schools? Now, I can't answer that question directly, but I can tell you that we're spending more than just about any other nation in the world. Switzerland and I think Luxembourg are the 2 exceptions. And for that, we are buying, if you will, a subpar, sub-average level of performance. So 500 is always set to be the international average on the Pisa. Standard deviation is 100 points. So you can see that the top performing nation on this science exam, Finland, performs about a full standard deviation, three quarters to a full standard deviation ahead of the United States, and they're only spending about 2/3 what we spend on our school system. Now, that doesn't say anything about are we spending it wisely, are we spending it where it needs to be spent, but I'm saying in terms of the amount spent, we're spending more than just about anybody. The other thing to look at is there is a correlation between how wealthy a country is, that is, what is its GDP per capita, and all these countries' currencies have been converted to dollars using this purchase power parity method. And you see there's a general trend that richer countries perform better, have education systems that perform better. In general, it's better to be rich than poor. Once again, we see the United States is below the international average of 500. And so I want you to think about what this means to a CEO of some international company who's thinking about where they want to locate their R&D facility or marketing or some service center. They could locate in the United States, and they could pay one of the highest wage rates in the world, and for that buy below average level of skills. Or they could pick some other nation, Finland, and get far superior skills and spend 2/3 to 1/2 as much on wage rates. So this is the competitive challenge that the nation faces. We in the United States have enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in the world. And the reality is that many of our workers are probably overpaid on a world level in terms of the skills they have to offer, the skills they have to sell in the marketplace. So doesn't mean the sky is going to fall tomorrow, but long term, this is a problem. We are going to regress to the mean in one of two directions, right? We're either going to get our act together and we're going to improve our skills, move up the scale in this direction in order to be able to justify the standard of living. Or, I believe, we're going to begin to slip down this way and our standard of living will suffer if we can't pull our educational level up. Now, we're going to go into another Pisa exam. This is the 2003 problem-solving study in Pisa. And I want you to see how different Pisa exams are than a math quiz, say. So this is their problem-solving exam. There is here a map and a legend, and there are two questions. The first question is, calculate the shortest distance by road between Newbin and Cato. Now this question is a little bit of a throwaway, but remember kids from more than 40 nations took this. So culturally, we don't want to make the test, do you know what a map and a legend is? So this kind of weeds out the kids who've never seen a map or a legend before. Here's the real problem-solving part of the question. Zoe lives in Angers. She wants to visit Cato and La Paz, but she can only travel up to 300 kilometers in any given day. But she's happy she'll camp out anywhere on the road in between if that's what she has to do. Further, Zoe wants to stay for 2 full nights in each city so that she has a whole day that she can dedicate to sightseeing. So here's Zoe's itinerary, and the challenge is to complete this itinerary. So we already see day 1, she's going to be camping out on the road in between Angers and Cato. Night 7, she'll be back home in her own bed in Angers. And so the challenge is fill out the rest of the itinerary. I think this is a wonderful example. It's not clearly a math problem. It's not clearly a science or a reading problem. But I believe that kids who've had good practice working on all 3 of those skills will have an advantage in this kind of a problem solving. I mean, there's no algorithm. Kids have to reason their way to a conclusion. Well, our 15-year-olds didn't do that well in problem solving either. We scored 29th overall. So I want to spend a bit more time on this exam and show you in more detail why I'm concerned. The first thing is just our rank order performance once again. If you look at the countries that are scoring around us, you will see there's Poland, Spain, Latvia, Russia, the United States, Italy, Portugal, Greece, Uruguay, Thailand, Serbia. These are not the nations you read about every day as being our economic competition in the world. Here are those nations: Finland, Korea, Hong Kong, Japan, Macau, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So that's of concern. The other thing that really bothers me is if you look at the kids who are scoring below the black line. That is, kids who are scored as a level 1 problem solver, or they didn't even get up to level 1 problem solving ability, they're below. That constitutes 57% of our 15-year-olds. 57% of our 15-year-olds are level 1 problem solvers or below. Some of the labor economists I've had the fortune to work with say these kids have no clear role in our economy. We're not producing that many low-skill jobs. So when these kids find work, it's going to be very low-paying work, $6, $7, $8 an hour, probably not full-time, probably not with any benefits at all. This is even if you have 2 people in a family earning a wage like that, you'll struggle to enter the middle class. The third thing that really concerns me is if you look at the percentage of our students who are getting up to level 3 problem solving ability, the highest level in the United States, it's only a third to a half what the top performing nations are doing. You know, sometimes I get the response, well, yeah, but look how big the United States is. So we've got more kids in this little slice than Finland does in this big slice. My response is, look how big the United States is. We've got more companies to run, more problems to solve. We need more high-performing students. And this is where we're going to pull our engineers, our scientists, our mathematicians, our business leaders, our lawyers. So this is not just a problem at the bottom. It's a problem that runs throughout our educational system. Now, I so often get the question, well, isn't this just a problem of some of our poor kids, that I actually went back in the problem-solving study and I plotted the kids at the 95th percentile level in each country. So the best kids, best students in every nation, and we moved from 29th place to 24th place. It's a move in the right direction, but I don't think anybody's going to feel like holding a parade around 24th place. I recently just did this for the 2006 science study, and I didn't have time to make you a graph, but I'll tell you that in the science study we came out, when I looked at the kids in the 95th percentile, in about 19th or 20th place. So again, it isn't true to say that our best students are the best students in the world. Does it make any difference? You know, this is the if we're so dumb, how come we're so rich question. Well, Eric Hanuchek from Stanford and Ludgar Vosman from the University of Berlin have published a study for the World Bank. And what they've done is they have looked at all the nations who participated in these international exams and created a score that ranks the quality of their education system and against the rate of growth, the annual rate of growth in GDP per capita of that nation. And what they have found is this is the international average in terms of the combined score they get on all the international exams. And so this is a half standard deviation and 1 standard deviation above that mean, half below, 1 standard deviation below. So you can see that if you can get your students to perform at about 1 standard deviation above the international mean, that you can expect to enjoy an annual rate of growth in GDP per capita that is about 2 percentage points above the international mean. 2 percentage points? What does that mean? Well, remember that graph that I showed you of the UK versus the US? That's about the rate at which we outperformed the UK's economy, but we did it for 125 years in a row. And so we zoomed ahead. So 2% a year is a great growth rate to beat the international average. It means that your standard of living will double every 35 years. And that is not what we've seen in the United States recently. If we look at median household income as a measure of standard of living, it more than doubled in the United States between 1945 and 1973. And GDP per capita more than doubled. Since 1973, in the 35, 37 years since then, our GDP per capita has once again more than doubled, but median household income has gone up 16%. If you look at median wages for a man, they're below the level they were in 1973, adjusted for inflation, of course. So the penalty one pays for not having skills in this environment is pretty severe. And you know, it's easy for me to think about this because 73 is the year I graduated from high school. So I don't want you to think that there was something magic about that year where all of a sudden we just fell off a cliff with our education system. That's not it. Many things have changed. If we look back in the early 70s, we were #1 in the world in terms of the percentage of our students who graduated from high school. We were #1 in the world in terms of the percentage of our citizens who had graduated from high school. That's true as recently as 1995. We are now 21st in the world in percentage of citizens who've graduated from high school. And we are about 12th in the world in terms of the percentage of our citizens who have graduated from college. So it's not that we fell off a cliff necessarily. We sort of stagnated. The rest of the world woke up to the importance of human capital development and education and caught up to us and then just kept going and surpassed us. So I will argue that this does matter. So in terms of what I wish Americans would understand, this is my personal wish. I think most Americans understand that we have lots of jobs moving overseas. Americans know that wages are lower abroad. But many Americans don't understand that other countries also have a better level of education and skill to sell. And they don't understand how that connects back to their local school. This is something when I return home to Central Illinois, I see a lot of confusion around this point. So people will say, oh, all the manufacturing jobs are going to China or they're going to Thailand or Vietnam because they work for $2 a day. Well, they don't work for $2 a day anymore. It's probably $6 or $7 a day. But the other thing is they also have a higher level of skill on average to sell. And that's a dynamite combination. When you have higher skills and you're willing to work for less, it's tough to compete. We in the United States don't want to compete on the wage rate, so we better start competing by raising the skills that our kids have. Something I think about a lot is why aren't Americans upset? Why aren't they angry? And I'm going to try and explain my own rationale for why I think this is. And in a nutshell, it's very, very hard for you to find out how your child's school or a school in your neighborhood is actually performing. Under the No Child Left Behind Act, which was really a grand compromise between our political left and right. I mean, it might be the only time that George Bush and Ted Kennedy stood on the same stage to celebrate the passage of a bill. There was something in there for everybody to like and something for everybody to dislike. For example, the folks on the political right didn't like the fact that the law mandated states to set tests and report the score out to the parents. As a compromise, what they did is put into the law that the states would be allowed to design their own test and set their own passing score. I mean, does anybody see a moral hazard here? I mean, if it's such a good idea, why don't we do that with our own students? Let them design their final exam and just report back to you how they're doing. So what we're seeing is what I call this Lake Wobegon effect, where all states report to their parents. Things are going pretty good. We've got some problems, but we're doing pretty well. But another facet of the law was that all states were now required to participate in this National Assessment of Education Progress, whereas before it was voluntary. So we do have a national test that we can start to benchmark how the states are doing in setting their passing score. So let's take a look at that. This is a Department of Education study that intentionally benchmarked each state's scoring versus the NAEP exam to come up with a NAEP equivalency score. So what does this look like? Let's look at 3 states that just happen to fall together in the alphabetical list. And let's look at the scores in grade 4 reading, which is a very critical time. If you talk to elementary school teachers, they will tell you that 4th grade is when they sort of stop teaching kids to learn to read, and they begin to expect kids to read to learn. And so children who are significantly behind in their reading skills in 4th grade are at risk of staying behind for the rest of their career because things really pick up and they just don't have time to make up the deficit. And you get what's called an accrued deficit, and it gets worse and worse. So let's look at how these 3 states, are reporting out to their parents on the state test how they're doing educating their kids. So Mississippi writes home and says 88% of our 4th graders are proficient readers, right? Hooray! Break out the champagne. Maryland claims 82%, and Massachusetts 48%. So we should all sell our houses and move to Mississippi for the superior education system there. But wait, let's see how they did on the NAEP. So on the NAEP exam, 18% of kids were ranked as proficient readers. 32% in Maryland, 44% in Massachusetts. Massachusetts wins this story in my book. They understand they have a problem. They're willing to communicate to parents and their citizens that they have a problem, and they're working to address it. You know, I have a tough time being angry at parents or even teachers in these states because there's probably not one parent in 10,000 who would understand how to do this crosswalk. And they're looking at the state scores and saying, hooray, everything's fine. So this is a graph showing the NAEP equivalency score of all these different states. So we have a handful of states, Wyoming, South Carolina, and Massachusetts, which have benchmarked their proficiency score on their state exam, I would say within, experimental error of where the NAEP does. Nobody's higher. And then the rest of the states are across a spectrum here. Now, I should have looked. I don't remember if they had enough data on Virginia to be in here. I don't see it. So they only were able to do this crosswalk in the states where they had sufficient data to do a statistically valid comparison. So what's our future? Well, our future is going to be more competition from developing nations that are investing lots of money and smart people in education and human capital development. What does this mean? And why should the United States work now to overcome these deficits and not wait too long? Well, this is a picture of the world in 2006. So the United States had the largest GDP in the world. We still do, even after the crash, even though it's stagnated a little. And then the next largest is Japan, Germany, China, United Kingdom. Since that time, China has moved from 4 to 3, has surpassed Germany in the size of its economy. Now this is just raw GDP, changed to dollars using that PPP method. It's not GDP per capita. Per capita, there's a lot more people in China. They're still a relatively poor nation. But there's something called the BRIC study that Goldman Sachs did, and they tried to extrapolate from the trends what the world would look like in 2050. So in 2050, by the BRIC study, China will be the largest economy in the world. Still, they won't have surpassed us in terms of GDP per capita because they got a lot of people. United States will be second. India will be neck and neck, a little ahead, a little behind. Brazil is going to be coming up. That's BRIC. So this will be quite a difference for folks in the United States. We have enjoyed a period of at least 50, 60 years, probably more, where people around the world would sit up late and get up early in the morning and think, how can I create a product that will be of interest to Americans so I can sell it to folks in the United States? In this world, everybody's going to be doing that for China. Everybody's going to be thinking, how can I tailor a product? How can I get into that market? How can I meet the needs of your average Chinese person? We will still be relatively wealthy on a per capita basis, but my argument is we want to fix these problems now when we're much richer on a relative basis than we're going to be in the coming future.